Good morning. So yesterday I was talking about permaculture and connections between elements and complexity of permaculture systems. And it made me think about the Food Forest card game, which is something that I created back in 2016 or so. And so people have asked me to create more videos about this, and I don't know why, but I don't always feel like being a marketing guy, so I'm not always marketing things. But I wanted to just show you a little bit about the card game and give you a sense of how this can work for you as a permaculture designer or just a garden designer to think about different connections in your garden. We're going to talk about the most basic of the games that you can play with this card set today, and we're going to teach you how to play that game. So anyway, the permaculture cards they kind of look like this is an example of the blueberry card. And what you have here is on one side, see this blue arrow? You've got inputs, which are basically things that the plant needs. Okay. On the other side, you get the same collection of icons, but these are outputs. So the ones that are grayed out are essentially outputs or inputs that don't apply to this card, but the ones that are dark, like in this case, the bee, which represents pollinators, and the crossed tableware, which represents food, those are outputs that you would get from the blueberry plant. It would attract more pollinators, and it creates something you can eat. On the input side of this card, you have water, because blueberry plants, they need a little extra water. You need to make sure that either they're super, super well mulched, or you probably have to add some water to your plants. Also, they do need pollinators. So even though they attract pollinators, they also need pollinators, so they can benefit from other plants that bring in pollinators. They need nitrogen, and they can benefit from a ground cover. If you don't want to be watering them quite as much, having a ground cover is beneficial. So those are the essentially the inputs and the outputs of the blueberry card. Now, take another card here. This is the clover card. You can see the clover card really doesn't require you to do much for it. In fact, clover will just drop into your landscape and plant itself without you doing almost anything. So the inputs are relatively nil from your perspective. Obviously, the clover needs some water, but you don't need to necessarily add that in many landscapes. It'll just take care of itself, especially in sort of the temperate climate, which is where these cards are kind of aimed at. This is not really a tropical game with the plants that I've added in. It's more for a temperate landscape. The outputs, however, of the clover card are food. Yes, clover is edible. There are parts of it that you can eat, and even though it's a little hard to chew, it is perfectly edible. It brings in pollinators. It actually fixes nitrogen, which means it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and brings it in with the use of symbiotic bacteria into the plant. And so you will collect nitrogen in your landscape by growing clover. And it acts as a ground cover. So that's another output of the clover plant. So the idea is, for almost every game that you would play with a Food Forest card game, you're looking at these inputs and outputs, and you're trying to match cards together so that one card produces outputs that another card can use. So in this case, you have the clover, which will bring nitrogen into your system, and you've got the blueberry card, which actually requires nitrogen as an input. So you've got clover has nitrogen as an output, blueberry card has nitrogen as an input, and thus they can be paired together in a system, but also in the card game to create a beneficial, use the word symbiosis again, between the two plants. And so that's kind of what the connections in permaculture are all about. It's taking elements in your environment or introducing elements into your environment that are mutually beneficial. One plant has outputs that another plant can benefit from. And quite often, those plants will have mutually beneficial inputs and outputs. So that's and there are cards in the deck where that you pair together two cards and you'll get that kind of symbiosis of mutual benefit between the two cards. So it's reflecting in the game what you would find in real life in your landscape when you were trying to plant with something called companion planting. And so these plants, if you're thinking about companion planting, these two plants are essentially companions. So in the gameplay, you would often place them next to each other. Just like in life, you might, in your garden environment, want to have clover close to your blueberry plant so you could actually have the blueberry plant benefiting from the nitrogen that the clover is bringing into the system. Or capturing for the system, probably a better way of putting it. So that is the most basic of the sort of the concepts that you get in the game, but there are more advanced games that you can play with it that take advantage of other elements on the card. Just briefly, you can see each card has a N, S, W, and E on it. That is your north, south, west, and east. Now some cards, it doesn't really matter which way the card is oriented. A blueberry card, you could plant it, this way, this way, this way. It doesn't really matter. However, in relation to the barn card, right? The barn card actually will create shade. And that shade can be a problem for your blueberry plant. So you see this barn card on the north, west, and east sides of that barn, you get some shade. The north side, you get a lot of shade. On the west and the east, you get partial shade, symbolized by the half shade symbol on those. So that means that if you've got your barn card and you've got your blueberry card and you plant your blueberry on the northwest edge of your barn or on the north edge of your barn, it may be, actually mostly in the north edge, it may be too much shade for your blueberry plant. Now you can see your blueberry plant, actually, it will tell you how much sun shade it needs, and that shows you that the blueberry plant can withstand partial shade. So in this case, you could plant this blueberry plant next to the west or east side of your barn. That would be okay. If you put it on the north side of your barn, too much shade. So it's just kind of another element that you play with in other games. The game I'm going to teach you, simpler than that. And then there's also some other details. I'm not going to go into all of the machinations that you can use in these cards. Just understand that for the game that I'm going to show you right now, all you really need to know is that there are inputs on one side and that there are matching outputs on other cards. And you're going to use the inputs that you need on this card. You're going to match them with the outputs on another card, and that will allow you to put them together. And those connections that you're making, that gets you points. So those points in the game are there to sort of show you these important relationships and that you're establishing these relationships. And the more relationships you establish, the more points you get. It's kind of true in life in your garden. You get more points if you're creating beneficial relationships between the plants in your garden, in your food forest. That's what the food forest card game is all about. So we're going to talk about a game today that's called Piclet. Now, Piclet, it's a game for 2 to 6 players. It's a simple game. You can play it with kids. You can play it with, I played it with 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and they tend to catch on pretty quickly to this whole matching thing, because the matching of, in this case, inputs and outputs, but it's a little bit like Old Maid, where you're matching 2 cards. It's a little more complex. They catch on really quickly at that age range. It's funny because I found that sometimes people my age, a little more mature, tend to have a harder time sometimes wrapping their brains around these connections. And so this game can be really helpful for them too, in terms of building the capacity for understanding the ideas behind companion planting. All right, so games for like 2 to 6 players. You can play it with a 6-year-old. You can play it with a 90-year-old, and it's beneficial for everybody. So the object of the game is you want to collect 6 pairs of cards. Now, a pair is based on one of these icons. So you've got the food icon here. You can't really see it here, but there's a water icon here. You can see it better on the blueberry plant, the water icon there. You've got the pollinator icon. So this is a pollinator attractor. You've got a nitrogen icon. So this one doesn't provide nitrogen, but it needs nitrogen. You've got a ground cover icon. And then, I'll show you one more card to give you a sense. The barn has a trellis icon, meaning you can grow food up the side of the barn. So it can work as a trellis. This is also true of some of the trees that are represented on some of the cards in the system. They're natural trellises. So a trellis is anything that you can grow a vining plant on. So a vining plant card would need a trellis as an input, and a barn would be able to provide a trellis as an output. So the first thing you want to do when you're preparing for this game is you want to go through and separate out some of the cards. So some of the cards are like instruction cards. This is a key to some of the symbols on the cards. Then there's a couple of games that you can, so this is an overview of the cards. And then there's a couple of games. This actually has the instructions for Piclet in it, and it has the instructions for Solitaire. You can find instructions for other games on the foodforestcardgame.com website. There are also there's like a welcome card, and there are some blank cards that you can kind of draw your own plants on and darken in the inputs or outputs that you've perceived that these plants have in your own system. So you can add to this card game with those blank cards. So first thing you want to do is go through and get rid of all of the blank cards. You want to get rid of the natural disasters. You want to get rid of the insects. And you want to get rid of 2 of the 4 house cards. So I'll show you how you do that. We're going to deal these cards. Probably need to shuffle them first. Then we're going to deal them in a diamond-shaped pattern. So, diamond pattern looks like this. All right. So, the idea now is that you're going to go around the table with the players who are playing, and in turn, each player is going to flip over 1 card. When they do that, every other player needs to pay attention because they need to be looking for inputs or outputs that match the outputs or inputs on this card. Now the Gumi card has inputs of pollinators and ground cover. It has outputs of food, pollinators, nitrogen, and nothing else. These infinity symbols, we're going to ignore them for the purpose of this game. They do apply in other games, but we're not going to talk about them right now. So if I turn over a card when it's my turn, or when it's anybody else's turn, if they turn over a card, and I see a match between an input or output on this card with an output or input on the other card, then I would yell, "Piclet!" and I would get those two cards as a pair. So I'm going to show you. We'll turn over a card at random. Now this card, as you can see, maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but the nitrogen on this card here, and maybe I'll turn them around so you can see them. Okay. So the Gumi card has an output of nitrogen, pollinators, and food, right? The Blackberry card takes an input of nitrogen, pollinators, and water. It also has an output of pollinators. So there are several ways in which these two cards connect. So the first person who sees that, not just the person who turned them over, but the first person who sees that, yells, "Piglet!" and takes those two cards. That forms a pair. And so that player now has one pair. Now this pair could be, this pair could have been made on the nitrogen for the input-output here. So this has an output of nitrogen, this has an input of nitrogen. So that could have been made as a pair there. It could have been made on the pollinators. See, this one has an output of a pollinator, this one has an input of a pollinator. You'll notice that many cards have input and output of pollinators, but they can still be mutually beneficial because they might not attract all the pollinators that would be beneficial to this plant. And this, let's see, we said nitrogen, we said pollinators, and beyond that, I think those are the two connections that you could make. So this could be considered your nitrogen pair or your pollinators pair. Okay, so you're going to want to collect a pair, one pair for nitrogen, one pair for pollinators, one pair for the food, one pair for water, one pair for trellis. So you can put this aside and know that you have one pair either for your nitrogen or for your pollinators. Later you might get another pair for nitrogen and say, okay, well this is going to be my pollinators pair. Right now you don't have to decide. Some cards are like that, some pairs are like that, you have multiple options on them. Other pairs, there's really only one combination between the two. So now we're going to replace the center card face up, right? And any card on the outer ring gets replaced face down. So now play moves to the next player. And that next player decides to turn over this card. Now this card actually has another matching input-output connection. See, this plum tree actually has an output of food, pollinators, and trellis, right? And it has an input. I'll turn these so you can see them. The plum tree has an input of water, pollinators, nitrogen, and a ground cover. Now the strawberry plant has an output of pollinators and ground cover. So the strawberry plant satisfies the plum tree's pollinator and ground cover needs. But for the purpose of this game, once again, you get to choose which one you're going to represent. So over here, you already have you might have decided you wanted to use the nitrogen combination there, or the pollinator combination, or you might not have decided. Well, now, if you were the same player and you yelled "Piglet" and you got this combination, you could say, okay, well now I've got a nitrogen pair, and here I've got a pollinator pair or a ground cover pair. Or you could use the nitrogen symbols on this to create that. So this is actually potentially a very strong, no, you can't use the nitrogen. I'm sorry, I have to back that up, because the nitrogen, this is a trick here, and you need to learn this, is that, okay, on these cards, nitrogen is an input for each of them. So you don't get to use one card's input for another card's input. Only if it's an output for this card will it apply to this card. So in this case, your outputs here that match are the pollinators coming from the plum tree, could be used for the strawberry plant, or the pollinators from the strawberry plant could be used for the plum tree, or the ground cover from the strawberry plant can be used for the plum tree. So we've got a couple of different options here, and since we've already used, we know we've used the pollinators on the other pair, or we've used the nitrogen on the other pair, we just have to decide which one we need to use it on. We can put that aside for later because we don't really need to decide just now. All we know now is that we have two pairs, and they're not identical in terms of their input-output combination. If they only each had pollinators, if this was a pollinator pair and this was exclusively a pollinator pair, you wouldn't be able to take this second pair. So now, once again, we refill the center card and we refill the outer card face down, and flip over this card. So this pair is a pair on the, this gumi produces nitrogen, that's an output. And the beach plum needs nitrogen as an input. Once again, they both have pollinators. So you're going to notice pollinators are pretty easy to get as a pair. But some of the pairs, some of the types of pairs are harder to make. They're less frequently flipped over in the game. So in this case, you would yell, "Piglet nitrogen," right? Or you could, once again, yell, "Piglet pollinators." Probably somebody else is going to get this pair at this point because you may not even need either of these two options. Right now you've got your nitrogen taken care of with this pair. You've got your pollinators taken care of with this pair. So if you take this next pair, you could do that on the ground cover. So conceivably you could take this third pair. Then you would have a pair on pollinators, a pair on nitrogen, a pair on pollinators, or ground cover. And this pair could be either pollinators or it could be, no, it can't be a ground cover. So it could be either pollinators or nitrogen. So basically now you've got three types of pairs, but what you don't have yet is you don't have your food pair and you don't have your trellis pair. So that's what you're still looking for in this game. So as time goes forward, you're going to have fewer options. So getting your brain around all of these different connections, that's the first stage of starting to understand why we practice permaculture as opposed to other kinds of gardening. You start to understand that these symbiotic relationships, these connections between different elements in your yard can produce more abundance with less energy from you, because when an element is providing benefits to another element, so when the gumi plant, for instance, is providing nitrogen for a nearby beach plum, you don't have to worry about fertilizer in the same way that you would otherwise if you didn't have that connection in your system. And so this is how a food forest built on permaculture design methodology can be somewhat self-sustaining. It still needs your input, it still needs your management, but by building upon the resources that you have in these different types of plants and other elements, physical things like your barn, your house, your duck pond, you're making the connections between these things, and that reduces your overall workload. So you don't have to be necessarily delivering water all the time if you have something in your system which helps to deliver that water. And so a lot of these cards represent elements in your system that serve multiple purposes. But the cool thing is you're learning about that by playing this game. It's kind of a fast-paced game. I went through it sort of slowly with you, but once you start seeing these connections and jumping on them and yelling, Piglet water, Piglet ground cover, Piglet nitrogen, the game really can speed up, and you'll find that it becomes very competitive in that way. But at the same time, your synapses are firing and learning about these connections. And then when you look at your garden again, you start thinking about things a little differently. Like, where should I put this? Well, are there any connections between these two things that happen to be in close proximity to each other? So that is an introduction to one of the games you can play with the Food Forest cards. And you can find out more about that at foodforestcardgame.com if you'd like to check it out. The cards sell for just under $20 a deck, and that money, the profits, goes to reforestation efforts around the world. So we're planting trees with the cards, with the profits from the cards. They are printed locally, not printed in China. They are safe to play with for kids. There's no toxic ink involved in this. Basically, this is 100% responsible. I run my house, or much of our electricity, off of solar energy. So we're trying to do our best to give back to the world, to leave the world a better place. And that's really why I created this game. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you will check it out. And I hope you will subscribe and follow. I'll be going into some of the other games that you can play in future episodes, just to make sure that people know how to use these cards once they've got them, and what they can do in their systems that they're building in their backyards, on their farms, and wherever they're designing food forests and permaculture systems. So thank you so much for following, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.